esta pequeña introducción me gustaría darle la palabra a Frank. De parte del grupo de investigadores, agradecerle el apoyo como consejero espiritual en algunas veces académicos de los trabajos que hicimos. Y también me gustaría tomar un pequeño minuto para agradecer al equipo motor de este evento, en que me gustaría darle un aplauso a los organizadores que hicieron esta maravilla de este. Sin más introducción, le doy la palabra a Frank.
Andres, you're going to make me cry. It's, of course, needless to say, what a delight and thrill it is to be back in Uruguay. I hope it is my sixth, but I hope it is not my last. And I figure, let's see, from 2001 to 2000, it's 14 years, maybe we have a celebration in another 14. I'm going to change a little bit the focus for this last session and move backward a little bit, or take a more bird's eye view on some of the changes that are experienced at the parent level and the child level, and the parenting processes and the child development, and look at the institution in which parents and children are embedded, the family. I think it was Heather Doshi who said that the first day that we were all indebted to Yuri Bronfenbrenner for the conceptualization of seeing children in a series of nested environments that become ever larger, and Bronfenbrenner understood very well that communities strengthen families, strong families result in better child development, and of course nations strengthen communities. I'm going to go through this very quickly because at 5:45 we're going to end. I promise you. Thomas has offered to stand and put on my hat, which is back there, Tom. 5:15. 5:15. We're going to definitely end at 5:15. Thank you. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to panic everybody in the room. So I'm going to give you a overview of the changes that have been occurring worldwide in family systems. It will be a very quick overview. Demographers like to call it the second demographic transition because it's the post-low fertility regimes that developed countries have largely entered into, and family forms begin to change under those circumstances, or often do. I've been a student of family change since my graduate school days. I studied with probably the figure who contributed most to this area in the 20th century, William J. Good. And Good used to say, we don't understand the process of family change in the world. He wrote about it in a book, and he sort of forecast that there would be pressures on family systems to converge as they became high-growth societies and with larger and larger amounts of capital investment and movements away from agriculture into a job economy. And so it has been that topic that I have come back to periodically throughout my long career. So I'm going to say something about what is happening globally, And then I'm going to pick up on an argument that I made in a paper. Banda asked me to talk about this paper, and I will do it in the course of this lecture, which is called From Consensus to Complexity, 50 Years of Change in the American Family System. Now, the American family system is not a model to be emulated anywhere. But there are certain tendencies, I think, in American society that have been replicated in other societies or resisted in other societies, and they play out in family change, as I'm going to describe. Just to start with the major descriptive changes that have occurred, and here I'm talking about the most developed societies, both in Europe and the Anglo-speaking nations, and to some extent, not completely there, to some extent being felt in Asia, in large parts of Asia, and being felt in other countries where development is rapidly increasing. And I list them there. There is a tendency for sex and marriage, the link between sex and marriage, to be broken, if not completely severed, then certainly frayed. Later demographic transitions, particularly the transition to adulthood, is occurring, as I will show, in a wide swath of countries. Breakdown of division of labor, gender-based division of labor, of course, is one of the tensions that is creating family change and responding to the changes that are occurring. The lower fertility, larger non-marital childbearing. I'll show trends for all the items I've listed here. But the picture is one of sweeping changes in many parts of the world, and sources, pockets, or areas, geographical areas, where such changes are actively resisted politically and culturally. So let me show a few figures. Marriage occurs less often and later in developed nations. And if you look at the dots, that's where marriage rates were. And if you look at the blue columns, that's where they are. They're in virtually every, this is a swath of OECD countries. The change has been pretty dramatic. In almost all nations, I've said marriage is later. Divorce is generally increasing pretty much everywhere, although divorce is becoming, in some places, somewhat anachronistic because so many people aren't marrying. We don't have figures, really, true figures, accurate figures of marital union separations, union dissolution. Fertility decline, everybody I think knows about that here, and it's more dramatic in some parts of the world, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But it is, again, very widespread and pervasive, and of course this is happening in Latin America, in most of the countries of Latin America. Sharp rise of non-marital childbearing, this has been mentioned before, but this is a spectacular kind of change that I don't think anybody that I know of, and I was a student in the 1960s, would have predicted. And so it's pretty extraordinary that marriage as a institution has, in the words of my friend and colleague Andy Cherlin, been deinstitutionalized. I think that puts it perhaps a little strongly, because it certainly wouldn't completely apply to the U.S., as I'll say in a moment. Growing levels of childlessness. This is a kind of indicator that tracks in, as you can see, in most developed countries, there is a growing percentage, now reaching about 1 in 5 in many countries, including the U.S., of women who will not bear children. Now, I like to pause, and this is just U.S. I'm now going to turn to some tendencies in the U.S. and ask really how they're going to play out worldwide in different countries. There was a quote I didn't refer to in the earlier slide by my friend Francesco Billari and Art Liebauer, that talks about convergence to divergence, meaning that many of the trends that we're looking at here play out somewhat differently at regional levels, at even at national levels. They're different. They're refracted through institutions and through cultural history that makes them manifest themselves. The kinds of the changes that are occurring manifest themselves differently. So yes, they don't marry in Scandinavia, but everybody couples, and often those unions are quite durable. In fact, arguably, they're more durable. The non-marital unions are more durable in Sweden and the marital ones in the U.S. But I mentioned before that the transition to adulthood everywhere in the developed world is becoming later. The U.S., which I've worked on extensively, I love this chart because it shows just how quickly over the past 50 years how much change can occur. So if you are reading it the way I read it, that in the 1960s, it was normative for most young adults to, and fairly much in this order, complete education, leave the home, or enter a union if it was a marital union, if it was a female, leave home, have children, and of course enter the labor force. And that change, which was normative in the 1960s, is now becoming rare, where people navigate those statuses. Even by age 35, the rates aren't as high for having made those transitions for some obvious reasons, marriage being one of them, and childbearing being much later. But really, the transition to adulthood has split into two phases. An economic one that occurs that may end by the mid-20s, and I don't think it's different for highly educated people here in Uruguay or in any of the countries represented in this room. So finish the economic transitions in the mid to increasingly late 20s, but mid-20s, and the family transitions, the family formation transitions, for most people are now occurring in the late 20s, early 30s, and beyond. So that's a powerful change, and it affects many, many aspects of both development and human development, and also social connectedness and social involvement, because young adults have, much like adolescence became a stage of life in the early 20th century, early adulthood has become something of a stage of life in the early 21st century. So what's bringing about this? Well, I think most of you have probably the right answers if I pushed you. Certainly market capitalism, which corrupts family authority to a great extent. That's the argument that William J. Goode made 50 years ago. But there have been a good deal of research to suggest that cultural change, and cultural change particularly, spreads autonomously and doesn't have to follow structural changes in the economy. It can occur autonomously. There have been responses, of course, feminism and the political rise of women's rights in many countries as a motivating source of change in family systems. And throughout, I'm now spending more time in Asia, and throughout a lot of Asia, many of the countries of Asia that are highly economically developed are having, in effect, cultural battles over gender. And these societies have been very resistant to certain forms of gender change, which has led many women just to withdraw from marriage and childbearing altogether. I sometimes say the women in Japan or Korea are going on strike. And because they can't, in a sense, make good headway in gender equality, they choose jobs rather than family, since they're unable to combine both. Certainly technology and digitalization itself is now becoming a major source of change in family systems. We haven't been very clever, or the people I know haven't been very clever in charting how that change works and what effects it has on values, on behaviors, but it seems very likely that the new forms of communication are spreading information in a way that never occurred before. And demography, demography plays out somewhat differently depending on the age structure of the societies. And now in many societies that have had low fertility for some time, and that includes much of Europe, many of the Anglo countries, and many of some of the Asian countries now, the age structure of the population is becoming quite different. For example, just to take the US, where it's not very dramatic, hasn't been very dramatic. As the baby boom ages, baby boomers age, we're going to go in the next 15 years from 13% over 65 to 20%. That's a big change in a very short time. And as far as I can tell, there's very little planning in the US, more in some of the European countries, but even countries like Italy that are confronting a real problem in the nature of the age distribution, have not quite figured out how to manage it. So, so let me say a little bit more about how change works on the ground. And C. Wright Mills, many years ago, wrote about, in his book on sociological imagination, described situations where there were cultural contradictions that couldn't easily be resolved in everyday behavior. So on the ground, people begin to experience that the logic that they have followed in the past isn't working. I did a study of teenage motherhood in Baltimore that started now almost, well, I say almost, but it was 50 years ago. And I was, of course, 6 at the time. And I had a ringside seat to looking at where the logic of marriage began not to make sense for these teenage, largely African-American women, young women. Both they and their family began to start to question whether it made sense to marry. So the mothers would say, wait, finish your education. Don't get married right away. Wait until he has a good job. And so that dialogue that I heard in families was really being played out on a larger scale. And I think that is the way change occurs on the ground. Now it's, of course, introduced by macro level conditions, economic conditions, or legal change, or whatever. But these changes now are occurring in some parts of the developing world and more important parts of the developed world where they have different cultural systems, like Japan or Korea. Now I want to add to this a layer that I've talked so far about the pressures on family systems and the changes that have occurred. But there's another trend that is occurring simultaneously that has been equally dramatic, I would say. And that is the growth in inequality that has occurred generally from the late 70s in the US. Different countries have different starting dates. France, I think probably only very recently, it resisted. Andrea told me the astounding fact that it's going the other way in Uruguay. But that's probably an indication of not highly developed economic system, because I think most of the change is being generated now by a service knowledge economy and advanced societies that makes jobs, makes education, and higher levels of education are deemed to be necessary for the skills and knowledge economy. It's not clear to me, it's not entirely obvious that all jobs require the kind of educational levels that are deemed to be necessary, but nonetheless that is occurring. And with that occurrence, I think has been that has been one of the main sources of inequality, of growing inequality, and the concentration of wealth at the top, the shrinkage of middle-class jobs, which have been quite dramatic in certainly many of the Anglo countries and many parts of Europe as well. So in the U.S., which I'm going to say this as a hypothesis, I think it's going to play out this way in other countries, though not necessarily in all countries. But in the U.S., we've seen over the past certainly 50 years, but I would say predominantly 30 years, the last 3 decades, the development of what I would call, what I have called a two-tier family system, and a sharp division between the patterns of family formation and parenthood and child advancement or child placement of children in in the educational and the stratification system. This two-tier system has pulled apart the family and created the family system and created an increasingly different family for the bottom third of the population, roughly speaking, from the top third of the population. Top third of the population in the U.S. is college educated. So this is largely it's largely a difference between college educated folks and high school educated, but no more. With the middle, broadly speaking, some college, which is a common occurrence in the United States, though not necessarily elsewhere. So what does this system look like? Well, I don't know. I think I've said this. It's probably worth saying that the two forms look different in this respect. One looks very much like the traditional family. I kind of call it the neo-traditional or in some cases symmetrical family, with men and women both being earners and so on and so forth. You know that. So we call that a conjugal system that's still based very much on marriage and marital ties. And then I think emerging in the U.S. and certainly evident it's been well evident in African Americans, among low-income African Americans, a more matrilineal system where it's not based on marriage so much as based on lineage. I don't want to exaggerate this too much, but it's worth contemplating. Is this a cultural or structural change? There are heated debates about this, and I think the question makes no sense at all. Dividing the world into cultural change and structural change misses the obvious fact that most of these changes are hand in hand. Sometimes cultural change anticipates and leads and lays the groundwork for structural change, and sometimes, more often, I suspect it's the opposite. But there is certainly a reciprocal nature of cultural and structural change. So a word about the privileged family system, which I suspect I don't need to discuss in here because many of you are either in it or headed for it. But interestingly enough, in the U.S., and I don't think everybody knows this, and it appears to be the case in many European countries, that marriage is actually stronger, has gotten stronger at the top. It may not be expressed in a formal marriage, but that's not the point. The point is how the structural form works and whether cohabiting couples become, as they have in most Scandinavian countries, equivalent to marriage. But it's a system based on two parents managing children, as opposed to a parent, maybe an extended family members, usually often the mother of the parent, being a parent herself. But at the top, we have a pattern of what's called what Annette Lareau, my colleague, calls concerted cultivation, where there's a very intense investment in children, monitoring, hyper-monitoring, engagement in activities, and so trying to pour as much as parents can in this child or in the children, as high level of social capital and family-based connections that often launch kids into the labor force, or help launch them into the labor force when they're ready. And a very, as I've said, a high level of scrutiny in what in a part of parenting which I don't think has came up in the last day and a half, which I think deals more with how parents manage the external world, not just how they relate to their children, but what they know about the external world, what resources they can use to help their children, and how they do it. And in some of the prior work I've done, I've tried to lay out that idea that has powerful consequences on how children turn out, as well as the interpersonal parenting process. This privileged pattern also, how am I doing on time? Okay. I'm going to leave question. All right, so I'm going to finish in 15 minutes. No, that puts us at all right, 5 minutes. I'm going to finish in 5 minutes. So I'm going to stop talking about this and talk about what I think is going to be of some interest in the study of families. We talked about parenting as if parenting were a constant process. But in the families that occupy the lower tier of the social strata in the U.S., we have a growing phenomenon of what I've called multi-partnered fertility. That is, how childbearing across households, in different households. And I think this is understudied, it's underappreciated. This is the complexity that I talked about in the paper from Consensus, the complexity. Because these families are becoming very elaborate networks of past and present parents who are in and out of the household, plus their children, who create half-siblings, full siblings, and just children from former relationships. So that complexity means that both parents and children are trying to get resources, parents trying to give resources and children trying to obtain resources, but the supply isn't very steady and constant. And the situation can, if not managed adequately, can be very chaotic. As figures come into the household, leave the household, but maybe leave a child behind. Now, I'm arguing that the U.S. pattern is I'm not going to say how widespread it will become, but I think in many parts of Latin America, such family systems already exist, where there's multi-partnered fertility, they're very complex families. I wouldn't say that's always a liability, it isn't necessarily, but it really depends on how well those systems are managed and work. So I think that it can be a real impediment to social mobility. I'm not going to say much about families in the middle, they're in the middle. Now, I will end with talking about certain kinds of value choices, which I think many societies that are experiencing, many nations that are experiencing rapid family change have to contend with. I already mentioned gender inequality and the policies related to that. That's a mixed bag, and as I said, in Asia there's been very little progress. In Latin America it seems to be quite mixed. In Europe, much more developed, though Eastern Europe differs from the Western Europe. For low-income families, and we heard about this, we saw this yesterday in the increase in childbearing and early childbearing. That's something I hadn't really realized until I came here, but I'm seeing that it's not unique to Uruguay, and I think it's an indication of this bottom tier having from a socioeconomic point of view, having problems with managing family planning. And in the U.S., we've seen a rapid drop in the rate of teenage childbearing. As soon as my book was published, my last book was published in 2007, there was it actually began to happen before then. I had no effect on it at all. But we're seeing a real teenage childbearing has been cut in by half. It's dropped 50%. It's so, that seems to me to be the result, and studies that have looked into how that's happened, why and how it's happened, it's because of better methods of contraception, more aggressive policies of reaching out, and the like. So I think that's a very important public policy that needs to be promoted. And finally, this is I can say this in Uruguay. When I say it in the U.S., it falls on deaf ears. But we really do have to have redistribution. We can call it something else. Redistribution in the U.S. is an ugly word, but without it, I don't think we're going to see the restoration of family, a more stable family among the less advantaged. I'm going to stop there and take questions. How am I doing? Oh, good. I have 7 minutes.
¿Preguntas para Frank?
Too weary, too tired, too hot.
I'll start. I just wanted to pick up on one of the last comments you made about that perhaps younger or disadvantaged women have trouble managing their family planning behaviors, and which I understand where you're coming from, but a lot of some cognitive research seems to say that actually for some of these teenage moms, they say they're quite happy about becoming mothers because they've got very little aspirations for the future, they've got very little to look forward to in the future, and they're saying motherhood is giving me my role in society. And so, in a way, it's kind of saying, well, how, again, going back to what we talked about yesterday, how do you disentangle the sort of socioeconomic, very, very bleak socioeconomic background that some of these families are in from even their family formation behavior?
Take care a little bit in what the reports are, whether they're prospective or retrospective. Because once pregnancy occurs, I think most women say, who keep the child, say, I want the child. So I think it's a decision after the fact. I like to sometimes say that economists study rational choice. We sociologists study rationalized choice. So I think in many respects, I don't think that is accurate. There are, maybe 20% of the women that I studied really wanted to become pregnant or were happy about becoming pregnant. I always argue if, I've said this before, even here, that if they had to take a pill 28 days in a row, there would be no teenage pregnancy. So many teenagers drift into pregnancy. It happens. It just happened. I didn't think it would happen, but it just happened. So there is a certain acceptance, and certainly the pregnancy is sometimes welcomed by the family, sometimes ferociously resisted. But I think I went back in one of the later interviews and asked the young mothers not whether they had wanted their child, but if they could have planned it differently, would they have? And most of them, not surprisingly, most of them said, and they had certainly been preaching to their daughters, don't you follow in my footsteps. Yeah, Tom. My last gasp?
Your last 1 or 2 minutes, and you may not want to get into politics, but your slide does say what kind of society we shape is a political decision. I would argue that certain choices are likely to promote economic and social well-being. Who do you think is going to make those choices, and how are these decisions going to be made politically? Do you think there's that much focus and that much rationality and that much influence
Well, we were talking
of people like us?
You know, I'm ever hopeful, Tom. But I have to say your point is well taken. We are experiencing probably a time in the U.S. where there's as low political efficacy as is imaginable. I'm not sure that's a constant. It's a variable in history. I think we've had other periods like it, and there may be some shift. I don't see it immediately, I have to say that. Well, if any other questions? Well, thank you very much, and I'm off to the airport, but I enjoyed this.